So I want to talk about the book of Revelation, and I don't know, have any idea really where many of you are on understanding the book of Revelation. So I'm going to just sort of tell a little bit of my own story of reading Revelation and hope that at some point we can make connection with what's going on. And then tonight we want to focus on the significance and importance of imagination in reading the book of Revelation. So my first real experience of reading the book of Revelation was when I was a high school senior in Freeport, Illinois. My wife and I grew up together. Our fathers were high school teachers and coaches together. So we don't know anyone that the other one doesn't know. Rather strange experience these days. But I did not read Hal Lindsey. I read Salem Kurban. Now, how many of you have heard of Salem Kurban? All four of you. Hal Lindsey is a more popular writer of the same thing, but Salem Kurban wrote a book that was fascinating to me as a high school kid called Guide to Survival, and it was a book for people who were not raptured, and it would be their guide to survive during the tribulation. And it was full of speculation. It's the first time I ever heard of a rapture where people would be removed from their car and cars would be careening into one another. I had not yet watched Thief in the Night, but eventually I watched it. And my children read the Left Behind series, much to my consternation, but they read it anyway. But I grew up with the idea that there would be the next thing on the agenda would be a rapture, and it could happen any day. And it's pretty scary when you're a teenager that this could happen any day. You know, you don't get to do anything in life. You don't get to leave home. You don't enjoy family life. You don't get a career. And then there would be, after the rapture, there would be this 7-year tribulation, following which there would be the second coming. So I learned the distinction between the rapture and the second coming. This was very important in the world in which I grew up. After the second coming, there would be a millennium of 1,000 years. And this is somewhat taught in Revelation 20, but I have since learned that everything that most Christians believe about the millennium does not come from the only passage in the Bible about the millennium. And what is in the only passage in the Bible in the millennium is nothing that they talk about in their understanding of millennium. So that's just part of the problem. And then there's a great judgment and then eternity in the New Jerusalem. So I grew up with this. And in college, I began to explore other options as I was studying the Bible, read lots of books on eschatology. It was a pretty big deal at the time. Lots of speculation whether Gorbachev was the Antichrist, because after all, he was from Russia. This was a big deal for those people. And he had a birthmark on his head, which could be connected to the mark of the beast. And it started to line things up. And so that was part of my past. And then in seminary, I felt like the entire issue of eschatology, the rapture, was a bit of an intellectual sideshow that just didn't interest me much. So I just sort of let that topic go out of existence until I was doing my doctoral work at the University of Nottingham in England, and I read through all the published apocalyptic texts of the Jewish world, and it transformed my view of the book of Revelation. But because I didn't teach the book of Revelation, hardly at all in my career, I never put it together that much. I just kept thinking about it, and I'd read the book of Revelation and think about it in terms of Jewish apocalyptic literature, but it wasn't something that I was able to put together. In the middle of my career, I became convinced that the book of Revelation was about the first century, and it had to be understood in the context of the first century. And as I said, I wasn't teaching much on it. I wasn't writing about it, so I wasn't putting it together. But what I learned at that time that was so important to me is that so many people that I grew up with, so many people of my ilk, and maybe this is not your experience, but they saw the book of Revelation as almost a terrorizing book that youth ministers used to manipulate them into believing in Jesus Christ. And so it became a book associated with fear. And I thought, this is the exact opposite of what this book is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be comforting people. Now, it is bizarre, but it is supposed to be a comforting book. And I realized that people that were talking about the book of Revelation all the time were only asking these kinds of questions. Who in the modern world is doing what in the book of Revelation? Who today can correspond with who in the book of Revelation? So, who is the beast? That's one of the big questions. And not too long ago, I heard a well-known figure, and I won't use their name or their address, associated with Vladimir Putin. And, of course, he lines up somehow with the beast from the sea or the beast from the land. And it's always about this speculation. And I always thought, I've thought for a long time that the people who spend their time speculating about who is doing what in the book of Revelation ruins the book and misses the dynamic message about discipleship in the book. So that's sort of where I landed as a student of mine comes to me one day and says, "Will you teach the book of Revelation to us?" And I said, "Well, I'd really like to, but there's no way I can get prepared for this in the next year or two because of all the things that we have to do at the school and the courses that I'm slated to teach." So after he graduated, his name was Greg, I finally got an opportunity to teach it with some master's students at our seminary, and I had a graduate assistant who was an exceptional student named Cody Matchett, and we worked together so much after a while, I said, Cody, I'd like you just to be the co-author with me on this book. So we worked together for over a year on the book, and then a long time with various editors at the publisher to get this book in the shape that it is. So I was sort of waiting for my opportunity to put some of this stuff together, and that's what reading or Revelation for the rest of us is about. And the rest of us is, as my son told me, is an echo of Festivus for the rest of us. But I took it from an author named Diana Butler Bass who wrote a book called Christianity for the Rest of Us. And this is Revelation for those of us who don't want to spend our time speculating about who might be doing what in the book of Revelation and try to come to terms with what it's teaching us about discipleship and following Jesus in the present life. The book is written to 7 real churches in first century Western Asia Minor. And that has to be acknowledged to make sense of the book, I believe. It is not written to 7 churches in the history of the church or to 7 future churches. It is written to first century churches in the circle of John, the author, and it is about their time and how they can respond to a particular problem that John calls Babylon. And Babylon in the book of Revelation is Rome, but it is also an image, a metaphor, a trope that draws upon great themes in Jewish literature, and it tries to bring that into the book of Revelation as a way of giving an interpretation of Rome and the relationship of these 7 churches to Rome and the empire. It teaches Christians how to live faithfully with Jesus when the world is an empire, when the world is an empire against them. It instructs church folks on how to follow Jesus, who is the Lamb of God, in a Roman Empire when almost nothing was in their favor. What does it mean to relate to the state when it's an empire, when you are powerless? That's what Revelation tries to teach Christians on how to live. And it teaches us how to discern Babylon in our world as well. If you read, and I teach my students that if you're going to read Revelation well, the first thing you do is you pick it up and you open it up to chapter 17. Now, my father was an English teacher, and I'm glad he's not with us now. He would find this offensive, that you would begin a book late. and begin toward the end. But if you begin in Revelation 17 with Babylon, you begin to feel the problem that John sees at work in this book, and he's trying to get people to realize what Babylon is doing to them and how it's reshaping their lives. And John wants them to resist and become a dissident disciple against the ways of Babylon and follow the ways of the Lamb. So that's sort of the discipleship theme that we will be exploring this weekend. One of the major issues about reading the book of Revelation, and I want to be fair with you about this, is that it teaches us how to be critical of politics. All right? And if I say things at times that sound political, it's because they are, but it's not because I'm lining with the Republicans or the Democrats. It's because the book of Revelation teaches us as Christians to recognize the presence of corruption in political governments and to speak up and to speak out against it. It teaches us to be dissidents and to resist the ways of Babylon, the way of the dragon. So there will be sometimes statements that may sound like politics, but I want you to know that I'm not aligning myself with any political party, and I want you to join me in that sort of criticism, even cynicism at times, about political powers. So it teaches us, the book of Revelation, how to evaluate political government morally in light of the New Jerusalem and in light of Babylon, these two cities in the book of Revelation. Okay? Now, if I were teaching, I'd ask people to raise their hands, but I have not been given permission to do that tonight. But I'm not a preacher. I'm a teacher, which means people ask questions. So if I say something, you really want to know what it is, just say something. I'm okay. I won't be bothered if you ask a question. And I like for you to disagree with me. All right? That's okay. I'm often wrong. I just don't know when it is. All right, to read the book of Revelation, then tonight we want to look at the idea that we need imagination. We need imagination. I think we need to look at the book of Revelation more the way we read Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia, rather than some sort of newspaper prediction of what's going to happen next. It has that sort of dreamy, fictional world about it that has a drama. And I'm not saying that it's entirely fiction, because I don't think it is, but at the same time, it has all these images that draws us in, and we have to go with these images to understand the book. And it requires imagination to do this. In in Revelation 1, John writes, who testifies to everything he saw. And he also says that he heard things. And blessed are those also who hear it and take to heart what is written in it. And John said, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and then blessed are those who hear it. This is a sensory experience for the author of this book. He saw things. And I was curious about what scholars of the Old Testament who study prophets and scholars of apocalyptic thought the word saw meant, because I wondered if John had a vision in the sense of that where he was, wherever he was, he actually saw something, or whether the word saw meant that he was like in a dream and he, like a fiction writer, all of a sudden began to connect with another world and watch these things happen in his world. So I wrote to these two scholars, friends of mine, both of them in England, and I said, basically, what does the word see mean in the book of Revelation? Both of them wrote back within, how it is in internet world, within a half an hour, and both of them said basically the same thing. They didn't think John actually saw something. They thought he saw in his mental state a sort of reverie, a sort of dream. That kind of vision the way writers who write fiction see things. Both of them confirmed this to me, and if you ask me afterwards, I'll tell you their names, but I won't put it on in public right here, right now. But you will know that these are two great scholars. John saw these things, and then he wrote them down. The process of writing is very interesting, and I want to look at this a little bit as a part of the imagination, but I want to make a couple other points before that. This book, most people don't realize this in churches, was read aloud to 7 different churches, beginning to end. And the first century world was, many times, reading communities were involved. People would get together and someone would read for the whole evening. You know, we watch the Cleveland Guardians in our home, because my son now works for the Guardians. We don't watch the Cardinals. And though we were fans for 20 years of the Chicago Cubs, we don't watch the Cubs anymore either. And that's what we can do with our evenings. In the first century, John would have sat down, or someone would have read this book to these 7 different churches, probably all at once. And a friend of mine who is a scholar of ancient memory and ancient reading techniques thought that the person who read this book aloud in those churches probably had the whole thing memorized and would have performed it in the congregation. So he would have maybe had the manuscript in front of him and looked at it when he needed it, but probably was looking at the audience as he was going through it in his memory to see if they were perceiving it, and if they weren't, he would extemporaneously clarify things. And the audience was not like Churches of Christ or Anglican churches who sit there very well behaved. They were Pentecostals. They were yes and cool and amening all the time, or asking questions. What in the world do you mean? And the reader would have had to clarify these things. So it was an engaged, Pentecostal-like experience of performing this book in a congregation. Oh, we're good. There's at least one in every audience who gets it. Okay. So those listening to the performance of this book were summoned now to an imaginative, sensory-laden, alternative world designed to reveal deep truths about God, the church, and the Roman Empire. So you have to imagine people listening to this book being read and going with it. When John said things, and we're going to look at Revelation chapter 12, they envisioned in their minds, they imagined in their minds what John was trying to get them to imagine. And this took them into a world like being taken into Narnia with the Chronicles of Narnia, and when the performance ended, they were dropped outside the wardrobe door back in the house, and it wasn't so neat. That's what John does with his readers. He wants us to listen to him so carefully that we go where his images take us. And we don't know where they're going unless you've studied this book really well. They did not know where they were going, so they were sitting on his words waiting what could happen next. All right? Imagination, by the way, fuels all research. Scholars, people in my world, are always imagining what would happen if we could put these texts together, and they begin to think, what would Jerusalem look like if we know the archaeological studies? They have to imagine these things. Imagination is at the heart of faith and churches as they vision what can happen in their community. Your pastors, your leaders, I shouldn't use that word, sorry. I grew up in a world where we use that word. Okay, just forgive me, all right? Mea culpa, all right? So these leaders are in rooms and they are imagining. what this church, Alameda Church of Christ, can do in Norman, Oklahoma, and in the state of Oklahoma. And this fuels their faith to reach for things they had never thought they might reach for. Imagination is at the heart of faith. Imagination is at the heart of art. All art performances are the result of imagining what could be in light of what already is and what is not. So imagination is important. Jesus fired imaginations of Galileans when he was preaching about the kingdom. He fueled imaginations when he told parables, because to listen to a parable of Jesus is to enter into a little short story that takes you somewhere. And then, you know what he often does? He subverts your expectations, and you think, ooh, I thought this was pretty fun until I realized it was about me. That's what he does. That's what imagination can do. Take us into something in order to experience it. Christopher Rowland is one of the great scholars of the book of Revelation and apocalyptic literature in the ancient world. And he says one of the world's here's what he says: apocalyptic imagery beckons us to suspend our pragmatisms and to enter into its imaginative world. That's what Revelation will do. It will take you into its world. Then he concludes with a rebuke of our unexercised imaginative capacities. He says, our imaginations are out of shape. We lack the skills to exercise our imagination. And I think that's very true. We don't have to listen and imagine. We pick up our Bibles and we read it. And we have computer programs that when we click on things, it'll take us to that place and we can see that place, and we no longer will imagine it. And when we take the images of the book of Revelation and turn them into art forms, we'll probably lose our own perceptions and imaginations of where those visions could take us. One last comment on imagination. Imagination does to reading the book of Revelation what music does to a poem. And you know, you've heard a nice poem, and then someone puts it to music, and all of a sudden, it's at a completely different level. That's what imagination does to reading the book of Revelation. It will take you to places you never thought you'd go. All right? You with me? Now, since I know you all have Revelation 12 memorized, and I don't, I'm going to read to you Revelation 12. This is a critical chapter in the book of Revelation. One commentator on the book of Revelation, I love this statement. He says, Revelation 12 is a first century political cartoon. It's about the woman and the dragon. It's a political cartoon. It's a pretty clever expression. So I'll read it for you. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun. Now, before you read on, I want you to think, who is this woman as we're reading this, okay? A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Now, we want the baby to be born here, but no, John stops just like that and changes the scene and says, then another sign appeared in heaven. An enormous fiery red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its heads. Its tail swept 1/3 of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who, now quoting, will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. And her child, now this is the only place the word rapture occurs in the Bible, or in Revelation. And the child was raptured up to God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness to a place prepared for her by God, where she might be taken care of for 1,260 days. Now you got to know that means something, 1,260. That's pretty clever. Then John stops that scene and says, a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was not strong enough, and they lost their place in heaven. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth, and his angels with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. For the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. This is one of the great songs of the book of Revelation. When the dragon, now this has been a nice song in heaven, but now we come back to earth. When the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle, so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the wilderness, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time, out of the serpent's reach. Then from his mouth, the serpent spewed water like a river to overtake the woman and sweep her away with the torrent. But the earth helped the woman by opening its mouth and swallowing the river that the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring, those who keep God's commands and hold fast their testimony about Jesus. Now, all those of you who picked up your Bibles during this time were cheating, because you didn't allow the imagination to go how the first century, when they just had to listen to it. And it really captures you when you listen to it. But still, we're better at concentrating when we can read, because we're not a first century audience. This is an amazing story. Who is this woman? Did you think about this? This woman has 12 stars. Now, the word 12 in the Bible usually evokes Israel. So most people think that this is Israel. But then Israel gives birth to a baby, and the woman who gives birth to a baby has a name, and her name is Mary. And then Mary flees. It seemingly becomes the church. And this is the way imagination works. As John watches this woman, it seems to be Israel, and then it seems to be Mary, and then it seems to be the church, because it's with those people who are following Jesus. If you read Protestant studies of the book of Revelation chapter 12, they don't even mention Mary, because they don't even know who Mary is. You know, she's somebody who shows up at Christmas time in a creche piece, and then we wrap her up and pat her on the bottom and send her away for the rest of the year. But Roman Catholics all think this woman is Mary. So we have a shortened imagination because we're not familiar enough with Mary in the Bible. And when my students ask me, who is this woman? I'll say, I think this is a Michael Jackson, Paul McCartney morphing scene. You know, what was he? Well, I can't remember the name of the song. It's a pretty cool song. Say, I think it is. But here it starts out as one thing, that you think this is Israel, and then it changes. It seems to be Mary, and then it seems to be the church. But you know that if it's Israel at the beginning, it's not Israel at the end, simply. So it's a morphing, and that's what John does to you. If you want to say it's got to be one person, you won't enjoy what John is actually doing to you. An enormous red dragon is involved in this scene. The dragon is identified as Satan, as accuser, one who brings categorical judgments in a law court against the people of God to try to get the people of God accused before God for judgment. The dragon's mission is to destroy this son. But God is very protective of this woman because of this son and because of the children that this woman will give birth to. And that's a cool dimension that we saw as we watched this scene unfold. 1,260 days. Now, probably you don't know what that means, but this is evoking the book of Daniel, chapter 7 and chapter 12. It's 3.5 years, or the same as time, times, and half a time. That's language from the book of Daniel. So John expects his readers to understand a little bit about the book of Daniel in order to understand it. This dragon pursues the woman. The woman is protected. The dragon spews out water. The earth or the land protects this woman. God is protecting this woman so that she can give birth to these children. Now, one of the more fascinating things about John for me, and this is something that I explored with my scholar friends, is when John saw something or heard something, but particularly when he saw something, he had to put words to it. When he put words to what he saw, he interpreted it. And the only language John had for what he saw was language drawn from the Old Testament prophets. And yet, John's book, this whole book, doesn't hardly quote the Old Testament. But it alludes to the Old Testament and echoes the Old Testament so many times that some scholars think there are like 600 echoes of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. John was so steeped in Scripture and in the prophets of the Old Testament that when he saw what he saw, the only words he could use for what he saw were words from the prophets. This is not because this is a fulfillment of a prediction. Rather, it is a verbal connection to the Old Testament that John makes because this is the only way he thinks. He saw, he heard, he pondered the impressions, he connected it to what he knew, and then he wrote it up. That's how the book of Revelation was actually produced. And when he chose to write this up, he chose to use a kind of literature called apocalyptic. In apocalyptic literature, this is a game that scholars play today of trying to define it and work it out. But as you read the book of Revelation, you experience what apocalyptic is, whether you can define it. It's all these images that are being brought together, bizarre at times, weird at times, angels zipping through the air, seals being opened, dragons throwing a third of the stars onto the earth. You know, these stars are bigger than the earth. Have you thought about this? This just doesn't work. But this is the way John is operating. He wants us to imagine those little white spaces in the sky being thrown to the earth as the dragon is exercising judgment against the people of God in the world, or trying to destroy them. So apocalyptic literature works with these images and expects us to connect to them. The other thing that I notice as John writes his book is that he uses the Old Testament so many times. And I just wrote down in some of the margins of my passage of Revelation 12, some texts that John is alluding to. Daniel chapter 8, Isaiah chapter 26, Isaiah 66, Micah chapter 9, Micah chapter 5. And so he's alluding to these texts. He's echoing these texts, but he never quite quotes them. So this is a part of how John wrote, is he used the Old Testament. I grew up in a world of the King James Bible. And I believed at that time that that's the language that Jesus spoke. It took me a while to realize he was Jewish. And he didn't speak King James. But this is what I want to say about the King James. The older people in my church could carry on conversations in the King James English. And we all prayed in the King James English. Now, we didn't have to talk in the King James English, but we were expected to pray and use the, halloweth and, hallowed be thy name. And all. We talked like this when we prayed. My father died when he was 91 years old, and whenever he prayed, he still prayed in the King James English, though he read the NIV for his Bible. That's how John is. When John talks and describes what he saw and heard, he is speaking in the King James English that he knew. It's called the Hebrew Bible. He only knew how to describe things in terms of the Bible. So when you're reading the book of Revelation, I would encourage you to look at your cross-references in your study Bibles, if you have study Bibles with cross-references. And it's going to take you a while in the book of Revelation. And just go back and look at all these passages and see what happens. Just slow down and let those references fill your mind a little bit as John is using these, and it'll take you an hour to read 3 verses. And that's okay. John wants us to slow down to see these echoes. So, imagination matters in reading the book of Revelation. And if we had time, we could read this over and over, and you would begin to hear and see different things as John, as it's read. This is important to me, is that when you hear the words read, that you imagine what those things look like. That's where John wants you to go. He doesn't want you he wants, like C.S. Lewis, he wants you to read about the Pevensie children. He wants you to read about Reepicheep. But he doesn't want you to go to the movie and watch someone else put it on a screen. He wants you to let your imagination determine what Reepicheep looks like. Or Pauline Baynes, who did the original paintings or drawings in C.S. Lewis's books. So I'd like to look at 6 lessons that the book of Revelation chapter 12 can help us with in Christian living. And this is just one vision and some things that we can learn from it. The first thing I think we need to see in Revelation 12 is that we are people of the woman. I don't care how you define the woman, Israel, Mary, or the church. We are people of the woman. Now, if you read the book of Revelation well, you know there's another woman who's going to pop up in this book. The whore of Babylon in Revelation 17 through 19. And these two women stand in contrast to one another. And you are either a woman, a person of the woman of Revelation 12, or you are a person of the woman of Revelation 17 and 18. Take your choice. We are called to identify with one of these women and be a part of that community. The second thing that I notice is that we are in a cosmic battle. You and I are in a cosmic battle. Revelation 12, verse 11, they triumphed over him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. The victory over the dragon occurs through the blood of the Lamb and the word of their witness. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them, but woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. We are in a cosmic battle, and I think that we are, in a scientific age, blinded to these things at times. That there is something deeper and more real than the reality that we think we're experiencing in this world. That there is a cosmic battle of evil versus good. And all the great fiction of the history of the Western world is shaped by this very theme of good versus evil. Darkness versus light. The dragon versus the lamb. That's the battle that you and I live in. And if we are afraid to recognize the presence of the dragon in our world, we will have a shortened vision of what this book is supposed to do to us. One of your own teachers, Randy Harris, has made the greatest statement I've ever read about the book of Revelation. I was listening to him preach in Lubbock, Texas, which is not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. In fact, it's so flat, you can see forever. You can see Mexico right down from Lubbock. Randy Harris said this in a sermon. This is the book of Revelation, he said. 3 points. God's team wins. Choose your team. Don't be stupid. That's Revelation. That's what John does in chapter 12. Either you're on with the dragon or you're with the woman. Choose your team. The third thing I think we learn in this book is that the dragon, or Satan, has an aim of death. The dragon's desire is to kill people, to destroy them spiritually and physically, to destroy their capacity to be a witness for the Lamb, to destroy their capacity by sucking them in to the city of Babylon. The fourth is this. This is where it gets very political, and you won't even know it's political when I say this. The dragon loves to make use of beasts or wild things. In the book of Revelation, the beast of the sea, the beast of the land, are political agents of the dragon in the world, and those with discernment who know New Jerusalem, who know the Lamb, who know Jesus, who know the testimony of following faithfully with Jesus, will recognize in political leaders the presence of the dragon. The dragon is using these people, these political agents, for evil in the world. One of the lessons of the book of Revelation is to teach us to become somewhat cynical and at least suspicious of political leaders who are leading us astray, and to have the discernment to recognize what is evil and what is good. And the more good we know, the more capacity we have to recognize evil. The more New Jerusalem we are familiar with, the more we can recognize the presence of Babylon. Fifth, we are, as part of God's mission in this world, divinely protected. As the woman was protected so the mission of God could be accomplished, so we are protected for what God wants to accomplish through us. I think we can learn this from the woman's testimony in Revelation 12. And the last point of our lessons in Revelation, number 6, is the victory has already been won. Jesus has been raised. Death has been defeated. But on the plane of history, God is working out the defeat of evil in the world. And the book of Revelation, as we'll look at tomorrow, tells a narrative where evil starts to run rampant. And God steps in and begins to put judgment and discipline upon evil. And eventually, evil is destroyed, which is the purpose of Hades in the book of Revelation, so that New Jerusalem can be established. The more we familiarize ourselves with the New Jerusalem, the more we're going to recognize Babylon, and we're going to see that the victory has been won, and we can join the Lamb in his victory. The saints in heaven know what the saints on earth don't know. They know that the victory has been won, and we need to listen to their song in Revelation chapter 12, verse 10. So what does Revelation do to people with imagination? Greg Stevenson, who teaches in Rochester, said Revelation symbolically transforms the world into a battlefield in which the forces of the dragon are arrayed against the forces of God. Now, I don't think that this means that we need to go out and start identifying every person we see. You're either a dragonite or a lambite. I don't think that's wise. But we have gifts of discernment to recognize in crucial moments that that was the dragon. That was the lamb. The book of Revelation symbolically transforms the entire world into a cosmic battlefield. And Richard Bauckham said this, and this is one of the great statements about the book of Revelation. It's a book that in all centuries has inspired martyrs, nourished the imagination of visionaries, artists, and hymn writers, resourced, not a very good verb, but that's okay, resourced prophetic critiques of oppression and corruption in state and church, and sustained hope and resistance in the most hopeless situations. I had a student one time who was pastoring 27 churches in Yugoslavia. And I said to him in class one day, I said, what is the people in your churches, what's their favorite book in the Bible? He said, they all love the book of Revelation. I said, why? He said, because God wins and they're losing. And they want to know that God's going to win. That's what Revelation does to people with imagination. The proper use of this book is not to speculate about whether Putin is the Antichrist. Instead, the purpose of this book is to become alert to the ways of the dragon in our world and to learn how to resist the dragon as dissident disciples of Jesus. Instead of following the dragon, we follow the way of the Lamb and the Lamb's woman, Israel, Mary, and the church.